Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 116. This is where we read philosophy papers on the internet and review them live for the viewing public. My apologies to my viewers. If all the folks that were here live, I had screwed something up before I started to reread a paper I had already read because there's just a bunch of them. So, I'm going to try again. I'll go to journals and as opposed to the top things because why not? I have no idea. It doesn't really matter. So let's see. Can't really do international journal philosophical logic. Reading logic off the page does not sound very good. Did I have anything from the Journal of American Philosophical Association? I did. I just did one from them a few days ago. Let's see. I don't know what Grazer Studian is. So, let's see if Forthcoming has page numbers on it. Load. Editor. And that's it. Okay, can't do anything from these folks. That was philosophy and literature. I was gonna go look back at philosophy and literature. It looked like at least their papers were more comfortable to read in Dialectica. That's a good journal. Forthcoming. Let's see what they have. Nothing right here because there's no page numbers. Color on the problem of perceptual presence. I mean, look at all those downloads though. Look at that. That's great. Let's see how long this paper is. 24. I'm not reading 24 single spaced. I'll be here for 2 hours. Lots of reviews. How not to argue against brute fundamentalism. Okay, that's 15 pages. That will make me unhappy, but I might have to do it. This is another 15. Let's see if there's anything shorter. Alright, well, I can't read it then. Alright, Dialectica, you've got too many, too many long papers. Phronesis. Okay. Hellenistic and Roman philosophy. That's 10 pages. How nice. The jellyfish's pleasures. Because there's some ancient philosophy here. Intrinsic value and the limits of justice. Why the ring of Gyges matters. 1 to 9. Alright, so that looks like it's here because it's 344 downloads. Oh, 330. Okay. Sorry, I got confused there. Thought it hadn't been, okay, so let's see. This one. I wonder if this is... This isn't an open access journal. Let's just see if jellyfish sounds good. No, I can't spend $25 on this. It's too bad. And then we've got this one. Alright, no, let's see what we got here. Intrinsic value, the limits of justice, why they... Okay, there we go. We're gonna do some ancient philosophy because definitely haven't read this yet. Okie doke. So, if you are good enough to join me live, and quite often people do, and it's nice because I get some. It's also cool if you can ask questions in chat, and I will try to answer them as best I can. Then you can ungrab the paper by typing !paper in the chat box because this link won't be here if you come like after I have started it. So, right. Let's see. Feeling all wrong-footed because I messed up earlier today. But that's okay. Sometimes that's better. Okie doke. So that's it. We're gonna do intrinsic valuing and the limits of justice, why the ring of Gyges matters. I don't know how to say this, but here we go. So, Plato. Glaucon, Republic 2. In Republic 2, Glaucon recounts the story of Gyges' ring in order to... I should probably know how to say it. In order to bolster the case against justice. According to the story, a shepherd named Gyges utilized an invisible ring to seduce the king's wife, kill the king, and take over the kingdom. That is... is this like the ring of power? That's a great ring. Glaucon argues that anyone who came into possession of such a ring would perform similarly unjust acts, and that anyone who would refrain from injustice in such circumstances would be thought wretched and stupid by everyone aware of the situation. Glaucon presents this as strong evidence that justice is thought to be valuable only to the extent that one lacks the power to get away with injustice. Glaucon's argument appears successful in showing that we do not value justice as much as Socrates believes we should. Yet we might still wonder whether it supports the stronger claim that we do not value justice for its own sake at all. Commentators such as Terence Irwin and Christopher Shields claim that Glaucon's argument could not show that justice is valued only for its consequences, because believing that power and wealth outweigh justice in some circumstances is compatible with intrinsically valuing justice to some overridable degree. Let's call this claim the Compatibility Thesis. In this article, we argue that the Compatibility Thesis is false, and hence that the soundness of Gyges' argument would indeed demonstrate that nobody values justice for its own sake. The upshot is that Glaucon's argument constitutes a more serious challenge to the purported value of justice than is often thought. The Compatibility Thesis. In explicating the Compatibility Thesis, Irwin writes, Gyges might suppose that justice has some slight intrinsic value in addition to the value that depends on its consequences, but he might take the good consequences of injustice to outweigh this intrinsic value of justice. In a similar vein, Shields explains that someone's choosing to follow an unjust path cannot show that they don't value justice intrinsically, because it may just be a matter of degree. In making such a choice, we would no doubt consider the relevant degrees and thresholds and make our decisions accordingly. These claims certainly conform to ordinary experience. People regularly choose Y over X, despite viewing X as intrinsically valuable. With this in mind, Irwin concludes that Glaucon should ask not only whether we care about justice for its own sake, but also how much we care about it. If Glaucon's argument cannot show that justice is valued only for its consequences, this raises questions about the point of its inclusion in Book 2. Here one might follow Shields in viewing the Gyges story as of little utility for Glaucon's purposes, but rightly included by Plato as a mechanism for causing readers to reflect on their level of commitment to justice. But Glaucon seemingly takes the thought experiment to have probative force in regards to his dialectical aims, and so we should adopt this reading only after we've exhausted alternatives that would give the argument more significance. Irwin proposes such an alternative. On his reading, what Glaucon aims to show is not that we value justice only instrumentally, but rather that we do not think justice is more valuable than injustice in all circumstances. Glaucon asks Socrates, "Do you want to seem to have persuaded us that it is better in every way to be just than unjust, or do you want to truly convince us of this?" Emphasis added here. So this every way, I guess, is what's the scope of the justice? Irwin suggests that we should understand in every way to mean better in every possible circumstance. So yeah, exactly. What is the everything in everything, actually? Alright. To appeal to the in every way clause provides a reasonable explanation for the role of Gyges' argument that meshes with Irwin's analysis. However, the context in which the argument is presented makes this interpretation rather surprising. After reading a bunch of these papers, you see how people are trying to be diplomatic in their criticisms. So, surprising is a good word. Note that just before the recounting of the story, Glaucon provides a threefold classification of goods and claims that most everyone takes justice to be a type 3 good, that is burdensome in itself and pursued for the sake of its consequences. And shortly thereafter, Glaucon prefaces the Gyges story by claiming that it will allow us to see most clearly that those who practice justice do so only out of necessity. This suggests that Glaucon's aim is to show that nobody values justice for its own sake, hence we have good reason to subject the compatibility thesis to further scrutiny. Normative objects and the limiting requirement. At first blush, the claim that valuing justice for its own sake is compatible with believing that considerations of justice can be offset by the allure of wealth and power seem plausible. This is a very, very topical paper, isn't it? Viewing something as choice-worthy in and of itself does not commit one to valuing that thing above all else. Nonetheless, if we look closely at the Ring of Gyges and what it asks us to consider, this analysis begins to appear less plausible. Consider first that the sincerity of our evaluative judgments is contingent upon our behaviors, dispositions, and the related judgments that we make. This is seen most readily when we object to our valuing it. To object of our valuing is itself partly constituted by ethical norms or standards. Let us call the various ethical principles, moral ideals, and virtues that one might value normative objects. If an agent genuinely values a normative object for its own sake, as opposed merely to feigning to do so, then she will not reflectively endorse behaviors and attitudes that directly violate the principles and standards of which it is composed. This is because intrinsically valuing a normative object involves endorsement of the constitutive principles and standards. Alright. To illustrate, consider the hiring of a manager who claims to value racial equality for its own sake. Suppose this manager consistently and intentionally favors job applications from members of her own race, even when they are less qualified than other applicants. When confronted about her hiring practices, the manager says, "I do care about racial equality for its own sake, but I also believe that whenever someone has a chance to help a member of their own race, that's the right thing to do." Valuing the ideal of racial equality for its own sake is incompatible with endorsing overtly racist attitudes and behaviors. Hence, we can conclude that the hiring manager either does not know what racial equality is, or else her claim to value it intrinsically is mere lip service. Of course, lots of literature on that stuff. Anything else to say about this? Not really. This is fine. Be that as it may, exceptional circumstances can make it possible for a person to value a normative object intrinsically while still acting in a way that might undermine it. For example, a hiring manager can intrinsically value racial equality while knowingly participate in racist hiring practice. It might be the case that a racist CEO threatens to fire the hiring manager if she does not hire a person of a certain race. The hiring manager may sincerely want to refrain from this practice while also knowing that if she does not comply, she will lose her job and health insurance, welcome to America, and thus having no means to care for her sickly daughter. If the hiring manager decides to follow the CEO's orders, it can still be true that she values racial equality for its own sake. It may just be that she values the life and health of her daughter even more. The crucial point is that the circumstances that render the flouting of a normative object compatible with valuing it for its own sake cannot be constituted by the very considerations that the normative object precludes from having justificatory weight. I guess. I mean, I've been reading a bunch of stuff on normativity, so it's like, sure, depending on a standard reading of normative, that's a fine claim. But there's like other opinions now, but I would think, they'd be minority opinions at this point. The reason is certain that the first hiring manager does not value racial equality for its own sake is that the ideal of racial equality precludes the mere fact of another person is a member of one's race from justifying the preferential treatment of that person. This preclusion is an essential element of the normative object. In contrast, it might still be true that the hiring manager in the second scenario values racial equality for its own sake because the ideal of racial equality does not preclude a concern for the health and safety of one's child from justifying the preferential treatment of a member of a certain race. Such a preclusion is not an essential element of the normative object. So we've got this essential element. I guess it would go to the semantics of the normative object, what it means. And then so these things would have to be semantically what these things would have connected here. I'm not sure how that goes, but that's okay. Let's see what they have to say about this. Let us turn then to the case of justice. As a normative object, justice is similar to racial equality in that genuinely valuing it for its own sake involves endorsing its essential principles and standards. Hence, valuing justice for its own sake is incompatible with rational endorsement of undermining behaviors when the ostensible justification for the undermining involves considerations that justice itself precludes from having justificatory weight. To see what the relevant considerations are, we need to look closely at what justice encompasses. Yeah, what does it mean, actually? Returning to the context of the Republic, we must remember that the discussants in Book 2 have yet to complete their investigation into the nature of valuing justice. However, any such investigations must begin with some basic assumptions. One reasonable assumption about justice is what we call the limiting requirement. Limiting requirement. Being a just person requires viewing the interests of others as placing limits on what one can possibly do in pursuit of effective goods, for example, wealth and political power. Not only does the limiting requirement seem central to any plausible conception of justice, the context of the dialogue suggests that it is part of the conception of justice with which Glaucon is working. First, the fact that the justice places limits on the pursuit of wealth and power explains why Glaucon has doubts about the value of justice in the first place. It is precisely because justice appears to conflict with self-interest in some circumstances that he implores Socrates to provide a rousing defense. Second, note that the idea expressed by the limiting requirement falls under the broad notion of fairness. A person who does not view the interest of others as placing limits on what can defensibly be done in pursuit of wealth and power is someone who places no weight on considerations of fairness. This is important because Glaucon invokes the notion of fairness when prefacing the Gyges argument in Book 2. In explaining why the ostensibly just person will act exactly as the unjust person would in circumstances of immunity, Glaucon says, the reason for this is the desire to outdo others and get more and more. This is what every nature naturally pursues as good, but by law and force it is made to deviate from this path and honor fairness. Here, Glaucon uses fairness as interchangeable with justice, and the limiting requirement is clearly involved in any plausible notion of fairness. Given the centrality of the limiting requirement to the very notion of justice, the analysis we are challenging would attribute the following set of judgments to the agent in question. A. One ought to view the interest of others as placing limits on what one can permissibly do in pursuit of power and wealth. B. Whenever the potential gain in power and wealth is sizable enough, one is justified in acting with utter disregard for the interests of others. Okay. The tension between these judgments undermines the compatibility thesis. It is difficult to see how one could coherently value justice for its own sake, while simultaneously judging that it is overridable by the very sort of considerations that it constitutively takes precedence over. Alright, so here's the grand conclusion of this whole thing, is that either you have limits on what you can do, or given immunity, you don't have limits on what you can do. Like I said, very topical nowadays in the United States, it looks like. So, the argumentative strategy here, I guess, is the inherent judging value for its own sake. So if there's something inherently good about something, that means it can't be overridden, given a potential gain in wealth and power is good enough. Alright, so I don't actually have much to say about that. There's something interesting about this argument in that this is setting up the way that the incompatibility here. But of course, I always worry, that of course people are very smart, that they've set things up in a certain way to make their conclusion look good, but it looks like everything's fine here. I'm just worried. Okay, 3. Justice as part of one's own good. When considering evaluative attitudes, there's a natural tendency to think in terms of the comparative value assigned to possible states of affairs without particular regard for how one's own agency is connected to them. And if valuing justice for its own sake, in the relevant sense, were a matter of preferring states of affairs in which justice is generally realized over those in which it is not, when all else is equal, then the compatibility thesis would be true. To see why, it will help to return to the example of racial equality. Strange as it would be, it is possible for an agent to assign intrinsic value to states of affairs in which racial equality is widely practiced, while also believing that she has decisive reason to prioritize interests of members of her own race. Perhaps the agent attributes no value to states of affairs in which individuals favor members of races other than their own, some value to states of affairs in which racial equality prevails, and most value to states of affairs in which everyone favors members of their own race. Likewise, it is possible for an agent to assign some intrinsic value to states of affairs in which justice is widely practiced, while still preferring unjust states of affairs in which she becomes rich and powerful. Hence, if valuing justice for its own sake were only a matter of having certain preferences concerning states of affairs, it would be true that assigning intrinsic value to justice is compatible with endorsing Gyges' behavior. Okay, so yeah, if you can assign different values, but you just assign more to one, then you can say, sure, then there's more value in one than the other. However, while we grant that agents with the evaluative attitudes described above are conceivable, they would not value respective normative objects, racial equality and justice, intrinsically, at least not in the relevant sense. Assigning some intrinsic value to states of affairs in which racial equality obtains is not the same as valuing racial equality itself, that is, racial equality qua normative object. A person who intrinsically values a normative object itself is someone who accepts and embraces the central principles and requirements for herself and believes that others ought to do the same. This explains why it would be inapt to describe the agent from the previous example whose strongest preference is for a world in which everyone prioritizes in the interests of their own race as someone who values racial equality for its own sake. Yeah, so if you're prioritizing the outcomes and you like the outcomes of racial equality, but you like the racist outcomes basically more, then you can claim you still like those outcomes, but you don't like them you don't care about them, but you do care about them, but less than the racist outcomes. Okay, but that the authors here are trying to force you into accepting that accepting the outcomes is not the same thing as accepting the normative object, as they call it, which forces someone to not to value the outcomes differently. So you're not valuing the outcomes, you're how you value the outcomes has to be what the normative where the normative force exists. Okay, that the relevant assessment concerns valuing normative objects here. Yeah, so valuing normativity in a certain way. That's where they're coming at this from themselves, rather than merely having preferences for certain states of affairs, is clear from the context of the debate in Book 2. The central question of the discussion concerns the ends and ideals that a person must pursue and adopt in order to live well. This is evident from the text. When Socrates declares that justice is among the finest goods, he says that anyone who is going to be blessed with happiness must love it because of itself and because of its consequences. Emphasis added. I don't see. Okay, this blessed with happiness here. The reference to the agent's own happiness is evident that the topic of concern is whether justice is intrinsically good for the agent who pursues it. Consider also Glaucon's introduction of the third category of goods. We'd say that these are burdensome but beneficial to us, and we wouldn't choose them for their own sakes, but for the sakes of the rewards and other things that come from them. Okay, so this is the end distinction that is really being made to show that are you pursuing norms for their good, or are you pursuing states of affairs for their outcomes? Okay, clearly the relevant notion of intrinsic value at issue involves choosing the object as a non-instrumental part of one's own good, and a person who chooses to pursue justice as a non-instrumental part of her good is someone who accepts and embraces the central norms of justice for herself. Such an agent would not think it is enough to perform the acts that a just person would on only those occasions in which she would not profit from injustice. This is because the non-instrumental value of justice could not be realized by the mere performance of a handful of ostensibly just acts. The value could only be realized by being just, or at least striving to become just. And one cannot make a sincere effort to become just while simultaneously endorsing the complete disregard of others whenever the financial rewards are sufficiently great. In light of these points, we reconstruct Glaucon's argument as follows. Any agent who chooses to pursue justice as a non-instrumental part of their good is someone who strives to become a just person. Any agent who strives to become a just person is someone with a reasonably stable commitment to justice. Their reflective endorsement of giving consideration to interests of others does not depend on the amount of riches obtainable by disregarding those interests. Any agent who chooses to pursue justice as a non-instrumental part of their good is someone with a reasonably stable commitment to justice. Anyone who would reflectively endorse Gyges' act does not have a reasonably stable commitment to justice because they reject norms that are central to it. Everyone would reflectively endorse Gyges' acts, at least in private. Nobody has a reasonably stable commitment to justice. Nobody chooses justice as a non-instrumental part of their good. On this characterization, the goal of Gyges' argument is not just to refute the claim that most people think justice is always more choice-worthy than injustice. Rather, the goal is to show that none of us value justice for its own sake at all. Okay, if nobody chooses to pursue justice for its own sake, this is a prima facie reason to doubt that it ought to be chosen for its own sake. We would need strong grounds for believing that so many people are making such a significant error. Hence, Plato includes the Gyges story in the dialogue not merely to force us to think about the extent of our commitment to justice, but also because it represents a significant challenge to the supposed superiority of the just life. Okay, so this all wrapped up kind of nicely, I think. I was a little worried at the beginning because I'm not a classicist. I don't know these stories well enough to tell you the truth, so I didn't know what was going on. But this, in the end, comes out as a counterexample to a theory of justice. So, which is a very nice, wrapped up quite nicely, I thought. The point, of course, is that if there is a counterexample to justice in the abstract, then justice can't be universal, as some people might like it to be. So, and that's so because the abstract commitment to justice can't be universalized. It can't be generalized. People are too willing to give it up, given the goods. If you have enough wealth and power in the face of it. So that's a question of how do we actually understand how justice we interact with the concept of justice, and if there's a counterexample at that level with our norms, then then there's a problem with how we even understand justice to begin with, which is a nice argument. Thank you, Plato, and thank you, authors, for making it clear. Yeah. So, I don't have much else to say. It's just, let's see. Oh, and I also like the argument against compatibility. Compatibility arguments sort of rub me the wrong way. And so the fact that these authors set it up to sort of like show you exactly what it was, but thank you, Moon. The way the author set up the dialectic here was nicely done. It's just, again, I'm out of it today, so what are you gonna do? And that is a great question, Moon. Who is my target audience? I have no idea. That is part of the project, to find out what the public in public philosophy actually is. I'm reading academic papers and hoping someone cares. I have no idea. But that's part of what I'm trying to figure out myself. So, I hope you enjoy at least some of this. If you are interested in what's going on in philosophy, I happen to know a lot of what's going on in philosophy now because I've read a whole cross section of very, very recently published work, and so I see sort of how trends at the moment and what's going on. I mean, this is ancient philosophy here, but they're showing how they're using the ancient philosophy to make a nice argument showing that people just are not committed to justice and what that entails. And it seems nowadays, with the political world at the moment, this is something worth looking at. So, and I mean, there's 11 pages double spaced, and I mean, the last page is references, and the first page is half abstract. It's not even long. So how exactly philosophy like this matters today, and where is the public and who is the target audience. I mean, this is a nice paper that explains one of the problems with understanding what counts injustice in a society and how does it matter. And I'm sure, and one of the number one responses I get is, "Thank you for reading my paper. I'm now at least one person has read my paper." That's what I get when I email authors that I reviewed their paper. So there's a question of what is all of this worth, and I'm trying to figure it out myself. So if there are no other questions, that's about it. Oh yeah, that's what I was talking about, is the incompatibility. This is also a nice setup to show what it is to be incompatible. What they did was they set up the problem here, or the two things that are incompatible. There's like the A and B here. But really they set this up, and then what happened was they showed that once you push, that this forces the argument into at the norm level. You're either talking about the consequences or about the norms, and so that's what this limit does. It forces the discussion to show that the outcomes are on one side and then the norms are on the other, and that's how they made this a hard split, is by using limits of what you can do to actually construct a two-side argument. So this is actually nicely done. It was well done, and that's how they got their result to be so clean. So that's it. I like the argumentation here. I think it's a topical paper. And that's it. If there's no more questions, that'll be it for now. I'll be back later today with more philosophy. Bye bye. Stay safe out there.